The autumn of 1892 came down hard on the Montana High Plains, and the wind off the Absaroka Range carried the first bite of a winter that promised to be cruel. In the town of Sweetwater, a small girl named Grace Colton stood on the boardwalk outside the church social, watching a table of donated pies with the particular hunger of a child who has learned to count every crumb before she eats it. She was 6 years old, her dress patched twice at the hem, her boots 2 sizes too small and cracking at the sole. She did not yet know that the words she was about to say to a stranger in fine black silk would leave half the town of Sweetwater talking for weeks afterward, or that her father, standing 30 feet away pretending not to be hungry, would never quite forgive her for saying them, at least not until he understood exactly what they had set in motion. Charlotte Pemberton stood near the church steps in her mourning black, her light blue shawl the only color she still allowed herself 4 years after burying her husband, and she noticed the girl the way she noticed most things now, quietly, from a careful distance, until Grace turned and looked directly up at her with wide, unflinching eyes. Amos Colton had been a schoolteacher once back in Ohio, before consumption took his wife Ruth and left him alone with Grace, and a grief so heavy he had sold nearly everything they owned to chase a fresh start in the Montana Territory. The fresh start had not arrived. A land claim he'd sunk his savings into had turned out to sit on rock too shallow to farm, and the small teaching position he'd been promised in Sweetwater had fallen through when the town council decided, at the last moment, they could not afford a second schoolmaster after all. For 3 months now, Amos had taken whatever day labor Sweetwater offered, chopping wood, mucking stables, mending harness, anything that put a coin in his pocket, and every single coin went first toward Grace's plate before it ever considered his own. Across town, Charlotte Pemberton had inherited the largest cattle operation in the county from her late husband Edmund, along with a stake in the Sweetwater Rail Depot that made her, by any measure the territory recognized, the wealthiest widow between Billings and the Wyoming line. She was 41 years old, and she had buried Edmund 4 years earlier, when a fall from his horse broke his neck on a frozen November morning, and she had, in the 20 years before that, never once managed to carry a pregnancy past its 4th month, a grief she had folded so deep inside herself that most of Sweetwater assumed she had simply never wanted children at all. Grace approached Charlotte slowly, the way a child approaches someone she has decided, for reasons entirely her own, to trust. "Ma'am," she said, tugging gently at the edge of Charlotte's black skirt, "are you going to eat that whole pie yourself?" Charlotte, startled from her private thoughts, looked down at the small, solemn face studying her with such careful attention. "I hadn't decided," she said. "Would you like a piece?" Grace hesitated, glancing back toward her father, who stood near the fence line pretending with great effort not to watch this exchange. "I would," Grace admitted, "but Papa won't eat so I can. He says he already had his supper, but I don't think that's true, ma'am. I think he says it so I won't feel bad eating without him." Charlotte went very still. She had heard a great many things said to her in her 41 years, condolences and flatteries and careful requests for favors, but nothing had ever struck her quite the way this small, matter-of-fact confession did, delivered without any apparent understanding of how much it revealed. "What's your name?" Charlotte asked, her voice unsteady in a way that surprised even her. "Grace Colton," the girl said. "That's my papa, Amos, over by the fence. He doesn't know I'm talking to you. He'd be embarrassed." Charlotte looked past Grace toward Amos, who had gone visibly pale, clearly having caught enough of the conversation to understand what his daughter had just done. He crossed the churchyard quickly, his hat already in his hands. "I apologize, ma'am," he said, his voice tight with mortification. "My daughter says things she oughtn't. We don't need charity, and I'd be obliged if you'd forget whatever she's told you." Charlotte studied him the way she studied cattle before a purchase, gauging the truth of a thing beneath its surface. She saw the hollows beneath his eyes, the way his coat hung looser than it should on a man his height, the careful, protective way his hand settled on Grace's shoulder, even as he apologized for her. "I don't believe I will forget it, Mr. Colton," she said. What happened next shocked the town of Sweetwater long before the week was finished, though at that precise moment it began with nothing more dramatic than Charlotte reaching for the largest pie on the table and pressing it directly into Amos's startled hands. "This pie belongs to your daughter now," she said, "and you'll do her the kindness of eating a piece of it yourself in front of her so she stops believing her father can survive on nothing at all." Amos stared down at the pie, as though it might vanish if he blinked. "Ma'am, I can't accept—" "You misunderstand me," Charlotte interrupted, not unkindly, but firmly. "I'm not asking your permission, Mr. Colton. I'm telling you what's going to happen." A small crowd had begun to gather near the church steps, drawn by the sight of the county's wealthiest widow speaking so directly to a man most of Sweetwater barely acknowledged. Amos's pride, worn thin by 3 months of scraping and swallowing his own hunger in silence, finally cracked in front of half the town watching. "I don't take handouts," he said, his voice low and strained. "I know how it looks, a man who can't feed his own daughter. But I've never once asked for charity, and I won't start with a stranger at a church social." Charlotte held his gaze steadily, something crossing behind her composed expression before she pushed it back down. "I'm not offering you charity, Mr. Colton," she said. "I watched a 6-year-old girl explain, without a hint of complaint in her voice, that her father starves himself quietly so she won't feel guilty eating. I buried a marriage that never gave me a child of my own to worry over that way. I am not offering you pity. I am offering you the plain truth that no man in this county should have to choose between his own hunger and his daughter's dignity, and I intend to see that you don't have to any longer." Grace tugged at her father's sleeve. "Papa, can I have the pie now?" she asked, entirely unaware of the weight of what had just passed between the two adults above her head. Amos looked down at his daughter, then at the pie in his hands, then finally back at Charlotte, and something in his exhausted resolve gave way at last. "I have nothing to repay you with," he said quietly. "Then repay me by eating alongside her," Charlotte said, "and by hearing me out properly, away from all these watchful eyes, before you refuse whatever else I'm about to offer you." She gestured toward a quiet bench at the edge of the churchyard, and Amos, still holding the pie, still uncertain whether he was being rescued or humiliated, followed her there with Grace skipping ahead of them both, entirely delighted with how the afternoon had turned out. Seated on the bench with Grace happily eating her slice between them, Charlotte explained plainly what she had in mind. She managed a rail depot office in town that had stood empty of a proper clerk for the better part of a year, tedious work involving freight manifests and cattle shipping schedules that none of her current hands had the patience or the penmanship for. "You were a school teacher," she said. "I imagine you can read a manifest and keep an honest ledger better than anyone currently failing to do the job for me. The wages are fair, the position steady, and there's a small house behind the depot that sat empty since the last clerk moved on. It isn't charity, Mr. Colton. It's employment, offered because I have a genuine need and you have genuine qualifications, and I'd be a poor businesswoman to let pride, yours or mine, get in the way of a sensible arrangement." Amos studied her for a long moment, searching, as he had at the pie table, for the catch he was certain must be hiding somewhere in this offer. "Why would you do this for us?" he asked. "You don't know either of us at all." Charlotte looked down at Grace, who had finished her pie and was now carefully studying the crumbs on her plate, as though deciding whether more might still be hiding there. "I know what your daughter told me," Charlotte said quietly, "and I find I cannot walk away from that knowledge and pretend I never heard it." Amos accepted the position 2 days later, after a sleepless night weighing pride against his daughter's cracked boots and the coming winter's certain cruelty. The little house behind the depot was modest but sound, a working stove and 2 real bedrooms, and Grace claimed the smaller room as her own with a solemnity that suggested she understood, in her own quiet way, exactly how much this changed for both of them. Their first night in the depot house, Amos built a fire larger than he'd allowed himself in months, and Grace fell asleep on the small braided rug before the hearth rather than in her new bed, too delighted by the warmth to move from it. Amos sat beside her for a long while afterward, watching the flames, feeling something in his chest that had stayed clenched tight since Ruth's death finally began, cautiously, to unclench. By the second morning, Grace had already named the depot house's resident cat, a scarred old Tom that had wandered in from the rail yard, and declared with great authority that he would now be living with them permanently, a decision Amos found himself entirely unable to argue against. Amos threw himself into the depot work with the same careful discipline he had once brought to his schoolroom, and within a month, his ledgers were the most precise Charlotte's foreman had ever seen. Freight manifests reconciled to the penny, shipping schedules organized with a clarity that saved the ranch real money each week. He never once asked Charlotte for anything beyond his agreed wages, and when she left a basket of preserves at the depot house one evening, he returned half of it the following morning, with a note explaining that Grace had plenty already. Charlotte found herself walking to the depot most afternoons, first under the excuse of reviewing the ledgers herself, though the truth ran deeper with every visit that passed. She brought Grace a set of proper winter boots without announcement, leaving them simply on the porch step, and watched from a careful distance as the girl's face lit with a joy that made something in Charlotte's own chest ache pleasantly for the first time in years. She began teaching Grace her letters on Sunday afternoons, sitting together at the depot's small kitchen table, and found herself laughing at the girl's stubborn insistence on spelling her own name with an extra letter simply because she preferred the look of it. Amos watched this unfold with a quiet, growing wonder of his own, watching Charlotte's careful composure soften a little more each week in his daughter's presence, watching a woman the whole county considered untouchably wealthy kneel on a kitchen floor to help a 6-year-old sound out her letters without a trace of impatience. Not every week passed smoothly. In early November, a large cattle shipment arrived at the depot short nearly 24 head from what the manifest promised, and Charlotte's foreman, quick to suspect the newest hand rather than question the shipping company itself, accused Amos outright of falsifying the records to cover a theft. Amos, stung by the accusation after months of careful, honest work, spent 2 full days combing back through every manifest he'd handled since arriving, refusing to simply accept the blame and move on the way exhaustion might have tempted a lesser man to do. He finally found the error buried in the shipping company's own paperwork, a transcription mistake made in Billings before the cattle ever reached Sweetwater at all, and presented it to Charlotte and her foreman together, his hands steady despite the humiliation of having been doubted in the first place. Charlotte studied the corrected figures, then looked at her foreman with an expression that left no room for further argument. "You'll apologize to Mr. Colton," she said simply, "and in the future, you'll bring me evidence before you bring me accusations." That evening, Amos found Charlotte waiting for him outside the depot office. "I should have trusted your work from the start," she said. "I did trust it," Amos replied. "I just needed the chance to prove it to everyone else too." Something passed between them in that moment, quiet and unremarked upon, but neither of them forgot it. Word of the arrangement spread through Sweetwater exactly as Amos had feared it might. Women at the general store whispered that the widow Pemberton had taken a fancy to some penniless schoolteacher and his daughter, that grief and loneliness had clearly gotten the better of her judgment, that a man with nothing to his name would surely take advantage of her generosity before winter's end. Amos heard it directly one afternoon at the depot counter, 2 ranchers exchanging a knowing look the moment he mentioned Charlotte's name in an ordinary business matter, and he left the conversation early, his jaw tight with a familiar, exhausted shame. It was the depot's old station master, a weathered man named Otis Bramwell, who had worked the rail line since before Edmund Pemberton's death, who finally spoke plainly in Amos's defense one evening over shared coffee. "I've watched Charlotte Pemberton run this depot's books for 4 years without a single complaint from me or anyone else," Otis said. "Whatever this town wants to whisper about a widow and a schoolteacher, I've never once seen you take a dollar you didn't earn, Colton, and that's more than I can say for half the men gossiping about you at the mercantile counter." But the true danger arrived not as gossip but as paper, carried into Charlotte's office one gray afternoon by a lawyer representing a distant cousin of Edmund Pemberton's named Cyrus Vane, a man Charlotte had met exactly twice in 20 years of marriage and never once trusted. "My client believes certain provisions of Edmund Pemberton's original will were improperly executed," the lawyer explained, laying documents across Charlotte's desk with practiced, unhurried precision. Specifically, the depot stake and the eastern grazing sections. Mr. Vane intends to contest the estate publicly before the Territorial Land Office at a hearing to be held in the town square in 3 weeks' time, where the county will decide whether the original claim stands or reverts to nearest surviving male kin. Charlotte's hands went cold despite the warmth of her office fire, because she understood, better than most, exactly how uncertain territorial land law could prove when a determined man with money for lawyers decided to test it. "Edmund left everything to me by name, in writing, witnessed and recorded," she said. "That will not change simply because your client has decided, 4 years after the fact, that he'd prefer a different outcome." The lawyer's expression did not waver. "The territorial court will decide that, Mrs. Pemberton, not you. 3 weeks. I'd advise you to have your affairs in order." That evening, Charlotte told Amos about the threat over supper at the depot house, Grace already asleep in the next room. "If Vane wins that hearing," she said quietly, "I lose the ranch, the depot stake, nearly everything Edmund and I built together. And this position, this house, I couldn't guarantee either would survive that outcome intact." Amos was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly in his hands. "I buried a wife and sold nearly everything we owned, chasing a fresh start that turned out to be nothing but rock and disappointment," he said finally. "I know what it is to watch everything a person built simply slip away because the world decided it was owed to someone else. What can I do?" Charlotte looked at him, really looked at him, in a way she had not allowed herself since the day at the church social. "I don't know yet," she admitted, "but I find, for the first time in 4 years, I don't feel entirely alone facing it." She reached across the table and covered his hand with her own. "Tell me about Ruth," she said quietly, "if you're willing." Amos stared into his coffee for a long moment before answering. "She had a way of making even the worst days feel survivable," he said. "She used to say Grace had her stubbornness and my patience, and God help the world once she figured out how to use both together. When the consumption took her, I told myself, getting Grace somewhere new, somewhere with better air and a fresh start, would be enough to honor what Ruth would have wanted. I didn't count on the land turning out to be nothing but rock underneath, or on how close we'd come to losing everything all over again." Charlotte's eyes filled with the grief of her own, old and carefully guarded. "I never carried a child past 4 months in 20 years of marriage," she said softly. "Edmund never once made me feel it was a failing, but I felt it anyway, every single year, watching other women in this town raise families while I raised cattle instead. I used to think I'd simply resign myself to that particular emptiness. Then a 6-year-old girl told me the truth about her father at a pie table, and I understood I hadn't resigned myself to anything at all. I'd only been waiting." Amos reached across and took her hand fully in his own. "Your daughter told a stranger the truth without a moment's hesitation," she said softly. "Perhaps it's time I learned to do the same in front of this whole town." We are more than halfway through Charlotte and Amos's story now, and if a small girl's simple honesty has stirred something in you, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss the next tale from this same forgotten stretch of the Montana frontier. What do you think Charlotte will say when she stands before the entire town of Sweetwater in 3 weeks' time? Tell us in the comments whether you believe Cyrus Vane's claim will hold up before the Territorial Land Office. Now, back to Sweetwater, where the whole county was already gathering for a hearing that would decide far more than one widow's fortune. The 3 weeks passed in a blur of gathered documents and sleepless nights, Charlotte and her lawyer combing through 20 years of estate records searching for anything that might settle the matter cleanly before it ever reached a public hearing. Amos worked the depot ledgers late into every evening, determined that whatever else happened, the operation itself would show nothing but honest, thriving management should anyone come looking to discredit it. On the hearing's eve, Otis Bramwell arrived at the depot house with something that made Charlotte's breath catch: an old freight manifest from the year of Edmund's death, buried for years in the depot's back records, showing a formal transfer of the eastern grazing sections into Charlotte's name alone, signed and witnessed a full 6 months before Edmund's fatal fall, predating any provision Cyrus Vane's lawyer could possibly contest. The hearing itself was held in the town square on a bright, bitterly cold morning. Half of Sweetwater turned out to watch, drawn by weeks of whispered speculation finally reaching its conclusion. Wooden benches had been hauled out from the church for the occasion, and the crowd stood 3 deep behind them, despite the cold, breath-fogging in the winter air, as neighbors murmured amongst themselves, uncertain which way their own sympathies ought to lean. Grace sat pressed close against Amos's side on the front bench, too young to fully understand the stakes, but old enough to sense the tension radiating through the square, her small hand gripping his sleeve throughout. The territorial land agent, a stern, unhurried man named Judge Calloway, sat at a table set up before the assembled crowd, and Cyrus Vane's lawyer laid out his case with cold, practiced precision, painting the original will as ambiguous, the depot stake as improperly transferred, Charlotte's 4 years of sole management as a widow's overreach rather than a rightful inheritance. When Charlotte's turn came, she rose and spoke plainly, without flourish, describing 20 years of marriage, 4 years of solitary stewardship, and the ledgers that proved the depot had only grown more profitable under her care, not less. Then, unprompted, Amos rose from his seat among the crowd, Grace's small hand gripped tightly in his own, and asked the judge's permission to speak. "I've kept this depot's books for the better part of a year now, Your Honor," he said, his voice steady despite the eyes of the whole town fixed upon him. "I've seen nothing in those ledgers, but a woman who has run this operation with more care and more honesty than most men I've known in my life. If this county intends to hand her legacy to a man who's set foot on this land exactly twice in 20 years, I don't rightly know what justice is supposed to mean anymore." A murmur moved through the crowded square, and it was in that moment that Otis Bramwell stepped forward and presented the old freight manifest, the buried transfer document that predated Vane's entire claim by half a year. Judge Calloway studied the paper for a long, silent moment, then looked up at Cyrus Vane's lawyer with an expression that had gone considerably colder. "This document, properly witnessed and dated, settles the matter of the eastern grazing sections beyond any reasonable dispute," he said. "I'm inclined to believe your client's claim, Counselor, has rather less to do with an improperly executed will, and rather more to do with a distant cousin discovering, 4 years too late, that this ranch has become considerably more valuable than he once assumed." The crowd's murmur shifted, understanding rippling through Sweetwater as plainly as if the whole town had been holding its breath together for weeks. "The estate stands as originally recorded," Judge Calloway declared, bringing his gavel down once. "Mrs. Pemberton's claim is upheld in full, and this hearing is closed." The square erupted, not in outrage, but in something closer to relief and genuine wonder, as neighbors who had spent weeks whispering doubts now turned to congratulate the woman they had so recently questioned. Outside the square afterward, Charlotte turned to Amos, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You didn't have to stand up in front of the whole town," she said softly. "You could have simply let the manifest speak for itself." Amos looked at her, Grace's small hand still warm inside his own, half of Sweetwater still murmuring behind them. "I've spent 3 months in this town swallowing my pride so my daughter wouldn't have to go hungry," he said. "But standing up in that square just now, Charlotte, I wasn't swallowing anything at all. For the first time since I buried Ruth, I was standing for something. I was standing for you." Charlotte's breath caught, and the careful composure she had maintained for 4 long years finally gave way entirely. "I offered you employment, Amos," she whispered. "I find I want something far more honest than that now. I want the man who stood up in front of an entire county and called this a fight worth having." Amos did not answer with words. He crossed the small distance between them, right there in the town square, and took her hands, and in front of Judge Calloway, Otis Bramwell, Grace, and half of Sweetwater, he kissed her. It was not a kiss of fleeting relief or public spectacle. It was a kiss of promise, of survival, of 2 people who had each buried someone they loved and had somehow, against every hard frontier, found their way to standing together in broad daylight. The weeks that followed saw the Pemberton Ranch, the name Sweetwater still used out of habit, though most had quietly begun calling it something else, settle into a steadiness it had not known since Edmund's death. Cyrus Vane left the territory within the month, his reputation considerably diminished, and the depot ran more smoothly than ever under Amos's careful management. But it was not the resolved claim that changed how Sweetwater spoke of Charlotte Pemberton. It was watching her, week after week, stand beside a quiet schoolteacher the town had once dismissed as another drifter passing through, and seeing something in both of them steady and grow that no amount of gossip could shake loose. Winter deepened across the Montana plains, but Charlotte and Amos were married that December in a real ceremony before the whole town, evergreen boughs gathered by Grace's own small hands, standing in for wildflowers the season could no longer offer, and a fiddle player from the Sweetwater Saloon donating his evening because, he said afterward, he had never seen two people look at each other quite the way they did that night. Grace stood as flower girl in a new dress of fine blue wool, the very shade of the shawl Charlotte had worn the day they first met at the church social. And when the ceremony ended, she ran to Charlotte without prompting and called her mama for the very first time, small arms thrown around her waist with complete, uncomplicated certainty, the old depot cat winding contentedly between their skirts, as though he too understood something important had finally settled into place. Charlotte froze entirely still, one hand pressed to her heart, tears spilling freely down her face before she knelt and gathered Grace into her arms, holding her the way she had once dreamed of holding a daughter of her own, in a life that had finally, truly, stopped feeling empty. Years later, travelers passing through Sweetwater still spoke of the Pemberton Ranch, though most had long since started calling it something simpler. The Colton place. The family with the warmest table in the county for any traveler who came knocking hungry. Otis Bramwell, grown grayer with each passing winter, liked to tell newcomers at the depot counter about the day a 6-year-old girl had settled a fortune with nothing more than an honest sentence at a pie table, always adding, with a knowing smile, that he had never once seen a piece of paper accomplish what that child's plain truth had managed in a single afternoon. They no longer spoke with the mocking whispers of that first uncertain autumn. They spoke with genuine wonder, the way people speak of something that had, against every hard lesson the frontier ever taught them, turned out right. Above the depot house mantel hung a small, carefully preserved slice of pie tin, kept as a keepsake from that first church social, and beside it, a framed copy of the freight manifest that had once saved everything they built together. It started with a little girl telling the truth at a pie table, Charlotte liked to say to anyone who asked about it, and it ended with the truest family I ever thought I'd get to have. Family isn't always about the blood that runs in a person's veins. Sometimes it's about the people who hear a child speak an honest, uncomplicated truth and choose, with everything they have, to make certain that truth never has to be spoken again. It's about the hard bargains desperate people strike simply to survive a Montana winter, and the quiet grace that can turn those bargains into something that lasts a lifetime. If Amos and Charlotte's story stayed with you, tell us in the comments which moment moved you most: the pie at the church social, the hearing in the town square, or the little girl who called her mama for the very first time. Please like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who still believes a child's honesty can change the course of 2 lives. In our next story, a wealthy rancher's widow takes in a wounded stranger against her better judgment, only to discover the secret he carries could either save her land or destroy everything she has left. This is a fictional frontier romance inspired by the real hardships of the American West, and while it touches on grief, poverty, and the quiet dignity of a struggling family, every difficult moment has been told with care and without graphic detail, brought to life here for your entertainment. Until the next trail, keep your fire burning and your heart open to the stranger at your gate. God bless the pioneers, and God bless the hearts that refuse to break.